Okay, hello everyone. Happy to see you all here. Yeah, let's get started. Basically, we all want our API products to be successful, right? And also, when we have to deal with other APIs, we all want them to be reliable, easy to use, and seen as a natural extension of our products. But what are the essential components that make a good API platform? How different are they at various stages of development of your organization and API products? And how will they evolve in the coming years? I'm Aleksei Akimov. Let's discuss this and other challenges today about building different API platforms. I hope it will be useful for you, so maybe you can use it as a step-by-step guide what you need to build in your work, or maybe you can challenge me and add your own perspective. A few things about me. So I've been dealing with APIs for quite some time already. For the last 6 years, I was working for Adyen, a big payment service provider based in Amsterdam. And for 2 years, I was the head of API there, responsible for API governance and strategy. And now I'm building an API platform in a small Berlin-based startup, Monite. It's an embedded finance API, invoice creation, invoice automation, accounts payable, accounts receivable, things like that. And yeah, Monite is an API first company, which gives also a lot of different perspectives of how we can go to market with APIs. And this is what I want to share with you. As you can imagine, basically, this was quite a big shift from a mature, sophisticated organization like Adyen, big API platform, processing hundreds of billions euros annually, to a very small startup where you have to build everything from scratch yourself, where you have to figure out a lot of things. You're always limited with your resources, so you have no time for anything. And yeah, this is basically the list of things how we are building the platform based on our experience and based on the experience in the industry. And what I also realized that before you even start building your API platform, it's always, of course, important to know a lot of things about the things that you will be creating. And there are a few parameters that are quite fundamental for you. So in this case, first of all, you need to understand whether you will be building the API that will be used for your own products and services, and it will be mostly like private and you control your API clients, or it will be an API that you distribute to your partners that you have some business relationships with, but still you cannot control how they use your API because they tend to integrate with you in many different ways. Or it will be a public API that you just throw to the public and everybody in the internet can connect to and use it in multiple ways. And also the scale, of course, is important. Do you expect just a few dozens or hundreds of API clients, or it will be thousands or hundreds of thousands? So based on this, yeah, there are some nice acronyms here. Small number of known users, basically it's a private and small API is basically something that you create yourself. But in my experience, when we are talking about API platforms, it's usually something big, something you want to scale, something usually that is more related to partner and public APIs. So quite often it's a large number of unknown users. So you don't know these users, or maybe have some business relationship, but not that much. And based on this, you can also define a lot of things, what you need to build and what's most important for you. All right, yeah, let's now start building and look at the different components that you need to have in your API platform. I tried to stack rank them myself, depending on how I see it, but also, of course, in your case, it can be very different. And the first thing that we need to start with is, well, an API. So, because without an API, the platform doesn't exist. Of course, it's debatable because it really depends on, like, if you're an API first company, if you want to have a lot of things before you even start writing your API. But at least what I see, many organizations, they don't want to wait a lot. So basically they already start coding, start experimenting. There are some hypotheses they want to test. So they're building some API. It can be small, it can be imperfect, but you really need to start with something. And it can be already a product that you have, and then you build an API to open up for integrations, or it can be a completely new API if you're an API first company. But API is usually in the beginning of everything. And of course, in this case, you already start making some decisions, some assumptions, and this will be quite fundamental for your future, for the future of your API platform. Then, of course, your dev team already starts making a lot of choices, like which languages, frameworks to use, which databases, what would be cloud storages, what would be the system architecture, and things like that. And this is also quite fundamental for the future of your API platform, because this defines a lot of things. This defines what kind of expertise you need, what kind of capabilities your platform will be providing, how expensive it will be for you, and how quickly you can develop. And of course, you can change a lot of things in the future as well, but changing your initial data and architecture stack is very, very expensive and almost impossible in the future. All right, so, well, now we have this wonderful code written, so we need to deploy it somehow. Of course, there should be some release process. Many companies do this differently, but also, in my experience, it shouldn't be super complicated in the beginning, because you want to go to the market as fast as possible. And in this case, it can be very simple. We just like have your code and have it deployed somewhere. What's most important here is that this process should be clear to everybody. This should be, I don't know, documented somewhere, so that everybody in your organization has the same understanding how it works. Because if it does not, then you would have a lot of problems in the future. And of course, if you already start exposing your API, even if you don't have any API clients, you already need to have some security controls in place. There are a lot of things that we can discuss here. Probably we don't need to go into that, because it will be a separate big topic on its own, but I just recommend to start with WASP top 10 recommendations and just go from there. And of course, if your API is exposed to the public, you already need to think about basic infrastructure controls in place, because you want to build a system which is resilient, which is like when exposed to DDoS attacks and other possible scam can perform well. So basically, in this case, you need to think about like load balancing, rate limiting, and things like that. And a lot of such things you can get with a proper API gateway setup, for example. But then, of course, it really depends on how technical your dev team and how much appetite you have to implement everything in place. So, yeah, if you think we're done and we can already get our first clients, no, not yet. So basically, there are a few more components that I want to mention here. Yeah, environments. So this is about separating what you're currently developing, and about having some staging environment, and about having a production environment. In this case, for the development environment, you can of course have even more separation. You can have development sandbox environment, for example, for your customers who try to integrate with you. And this is super crucial, because if you do everything in the same environment, things can fail very fast. And of course, there are also controls that many API makers forget about in the beginning. Proper identity and access management architecture. So this is linked, of course, to the authentication mechanism that you choose, and then how it will be implemented internally in your system. But this is also one of the things that is very hard to change in the future. And yeah, basically, this design will affect both the implementation of your platform internally, but also the implementation of your API design. What kind of authentication mechanism your API consumers will be using. And of course, we need documentation. So nobody can integrate without documentation. As our colleagues from RiseDocs community usually say, docs, so it didn't happen. Creating great documentation is a big science on its own. But I think the most important components here is, first of all, great tooling and great team of technical writers who own documentation as a product. Then, of course, if every team in your organization sees documentation as an essential part of definition of done, in this case, then you can have it. And according to most surveys, quality of your platform is the most important component for winning hearts of API clients. In this case, of course, you can do shift left of your quality assurance and make it part of a day-to-day development process of your development teams. But at the same time, you can think about maybe setting up a separate QA team and making sure that you have all the necessary components and things in place. almost there. We can get our first API clients. But before getting them, we need to make sure that we have some legal framework in place. Many tech folks never have to deal with that, but it's super important, super crucial. Your business cannot run properly if you don't have it here. So basically, you need to have terms and conditions, so maybe contract agreements with your customers. You need to think about not only the business side, but also about SLAs and a lot of things that are written down there. But without that, it cannot go live. And the last component here is basically the data strategy, because you have to deal with a lot of data, and this is also linked to the previous item. You need to understand maybe what kind of data you're allowed to process, and if you're allowed, how you should deal with that. Do you need to market properly, how you should store, how you should, what's the retention policy, and how you can delete that. And that's enough to get first API clients. But of course, that's not enough to have a successful API platform. Yeah, there are a few more things we can do here. And this is the one that I didn't mention before, having a good developer dashboard or console for your clients who will be integrating with you. Sometimes it's not necessary, but sometimes it's a prerequisite before even you get any first API client live on your platform. With this, your clients can register their accounts, they can get authentication credentials and things like that. But this is also an essential component without which your platform cannot operate well. And of course, once you have somebody already using your platform, you need to understand what's going on there. So you need to have good observability into what's happening there and monitor and have alert system and things like that. And this is both to prevent abusing of your platform, but also to understand if your customers are actually doing great, if there are any errors maybe or something you can look into and need to fix. And every time you have an update on your platform, you can easily also break things. So without this, you cannot move further. And of course, there are a lot of already tooling and frameworks embedded into existing API management solution, but most likely you have also to build something yourself. And of course, if you have this data and monitoring tools, you need to have somebody like people who are looking into that, and you need to have process, you need to have somebody maybe on call or on duty, depending on your SLAs, maybe you should be able to fix some issues, I don't know, during the weekends and things like that. You can survive without it for some time, especially if you're a small startup of 10 people, but if you have like very big customers, you already need to think how to properly do this and things like that. And this is also maybe a moment to think about the modern CI/CD setup. Before it was just a simple release process, but of course, integration with a lot of modern tools will definitely help here. All right, the next topic is pretty much linked to the previous talk that we had here in this room about breaking changes, because every time you have a breaking change, you cannot have any breaking changes at all, because no API is perfect from the beginning. You have to change things, of course. But there is a very good mechanism for that, API versioning. The problem is that there is no single consensus in the industry how this API versioning should look like. It can be, as I mentioned here, URL-based or header-based. It can be semantic versioning, can be date-based versioning. And when I tried to do the research and look at different best practices from the industry, it was like 20 pages document of all the suggestions and considerations. Who was dealing with that really knows how it is. But the important thing is that you just need to have it. You need to have it and have it documented on your public documentation website so that your clients know what to expect. And after it's like shared knowledge, then you can introduce breaking changes. Especially if you're small, if you're in the very beginning, you definitely change a lot of things and you definitely break a lot of things. And probably before that, you will operate in your business, your API platform mostly in one region where you started. But as your business grows, you have to go to other regions, and then you will need to decide not only from the data point of view, but also from the scalability point of view, how to properly do this, how it should be implemented from the API point of view. Should it be, I don't know, different also endpoints, different data centers, different authentication mechanisms. A lot of considerations here, both business side and tech side, but this is important for you to scale. And then, of course, depending on your integration type, you need to think about a lot of other essential components of your API. It can be done earlier, by the way, but if you have a lot of asynchronous operations in your API integration. In this case, of course, you need to always communicate events via webhooks. If you have not implemented webhooks before, then you need to have it. And if you don't have versioning for webhooks, you need to implement versioning, and then it becomes a really big thing and so on. And then, of course, for example, in the payments industry, it's super important to implement idempotency in a proper way for post requests when you make a payment and for example, the connection was broken on a mobile app. You don't want to be charged twice or thrice every time you click a button, so it should be just one request. So there are a lot of technical considerations about that, and this is also quite important at this stage when you still have, I don't know, less than maybe 10 customers. And after that, if we survive the first storms and now we're ready to conquer the entire world with our API platform, there are a few last things that we really need to implement. Maybe this is the time to think about the more sophisticated release process, because you really need to be able to update your system fast. You really need to be able to maybe do the soft launch of certain functionality for different customers and use feature toggles for that. There are a lot of things you can do here, and of course you can do this earlier, but at this time you really need to do this after, otherwise you will not be able to have a resilient platform. Then, of course, even like maybe earlier, you need to have special team of tech support or integration managers or somebody like that who is supporting your partners, depending, of course, on the business needs and everything else. And normally in a startup, it's just a shared responsibility between, I don't know, key developers and other people. But if you want this to be a professional function of your organization, and if you want to scale, you really need to have it at this stage. And of course, the cost of every integration or every lost customer is very huge. So in this case, it's not only the documentation that you can benefit from, you can create a lot of other tutorials, customer integrations on GitHub, libraries, Postman collections, open API files, and things like that. And of course, people who will have to deal with your API, they will either love it or hate it. And this is called developer experience. To achieve best developer experience, you need to think about a lot of small things. And you can already prevent inconsistencies and a lot of mistakes with having a proper API style guide. I recommend having this in the very beginning, but many companies start thinking about this only when they want to polish what they have. And my recommendation is just not to start maybe creating your own style guide, because it's a lot. It's more than, I don't know, several hundred rules that you can create. You can just take one of the open source style guides. For example, we also open source one, and also automate it as much as possible with tools like Spectral, for example, which is very, very handy. And also at this point, maybe many organizations start thinking, okay, what's wrong with our APIs? Why people are not happy? And then they start learning about API first and having proper process for API design reviews, building API strategy, having API console. Again, my recommendation is to start this early, but this can also happen that it's only not the essential component, but the component that really makes your API perfect. And in addition to that, yeah, you can learn from your developers and from developers who are using your API how to properly, how things should be done in the way that makes them happy. And for that, you can build developer relations and have developer advocacy team. And I'm trying to be very fast because my time is almost over. So basically, the last point here is just try to measure what's going on. Try to use metrics, any possible metrics from different parts of your business to understand how successful your API platform is. So in a nutshell, there are a lot of things that we can do here. And as you noticed, at least in my experience, building a successful API platform is a very complicated technical challenge, but it's not only technical. There are a lot of things connected to each other: product, business, legal, a lot of things that you need to think about. And that's why not every company wants to go that route, or not every company chooses all these components. So it really depends on what you want to do and what kind of ambitions you have. But it's very interesting. It's very interesting to observe and to be here and to discuss. And if you think how this will go and how this will be developed in the next 10 years, basically, I suggest to think about this in two ways: evolutionary and revolutionary. So obviously, a lot of components that we have right now will just develop by itself. There is so much interest. We see a lot of tooling being improved, a lot of tooling being open sourced, a lot of approaches. And it looks like maybe after a few years, it will be so well connected to each other. So a lot of things like good documentation, developer experience, API style guides, it will just become a commodity. So it's like given, you cannot have bad APIs. Of course, I hope for that. But if you think about revolutionary changes in the industry, I would say let's maybe look at what's happening around us. And of course, for example, Web 3.0 seems to be struggling now with a lot of things. There are a lot of comments and about the efficiency of blockchain and everything else, but the world wants to be distributed, the world decentralized, the world also at the same time wants to be connected, and this means that maybe there will be even more symbiosis between traditional web APIs and everything that runs on blockchain, or maybe there will be some new technology. Also, I really think that API should become plug and play, so we shouldn't write so much code and so much documentation, so it should be just like working. I don't know how exactly it should be done, but I know, for example, there is a project, superface.ai, that is dedicated exactly to that, so really nice. And I think a lot of innovation will come from there. And of course, quantum computing. So currently it exists in its own bubble, but perhaps it will need to be connected to a lot of things and a lot of products that people use on a daily basis. And this means that we can also expect some innovation there. That's it. Thank you very much. If you have any comments, ideas, of course, you can contact me on social media, but also if we have time, we can discuss some things right now.
Thank you, Aleksei. And while Mariuka plugs her laptop, we have time for 1 or 2 questions about the components. Yes, there is a question here. The microphone arrive.
So you mentioned versioning of APIs. How about deprecating existing versions of an API? How to go about that? Any thoughts?
Yes, deprecating is even more complicated. I know that. So I think the main component here, first of all, is setting expectations. So it should be somewhere, I don't know, in a legal agreement or somewhere in public communication that after some time this API will be deprecated, and this is the amount of time that you need to prepare the change. But then, of course, it's dependent on your relationships with your API clients. So basically, if you need some hand-holding and support, this can happen. Otherwise, you can just deprecate on a certain day. And maybe you can say it's deprecated, but also monitor who is actually using that. So there are some tips and tricks like that.
Maybe one more question? No, I can ask one. So in all the components you describe, maybe something was not completely obvious. It's about the skilling and the culture that needs to be expanded around API in organization. Do you have thoughts around how you monetize maybe enroll new developers, new people who have not worked on APIs or work in different ways, and not mold them, but help them to acquire your own culture?
That's a very good question. And I touched upon this just a very little at the end because I was running out of time. But I think this is a prerequisite for being successful. Basically, it's important that you state that your company is API first, and everybody understands what API first is. It's a challenge. And a lot of, for example, my time is to work directly with the teams, with developers, helping them, building APIs, learning, discussing, listening to their feedback, enabling them so that they also understand they can influence and build great APIs. But it's a hard work. Yeah.
Thank you very much.